Hi, everybody. This is Dmitry Wolfovich with Spiral Process Podcast. Today we have special guests, Ayla Sellers and Jason White, AMFTs. Welcome. Today the topic is called the overlap between ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy,
hmm
and process therapy.
hmm Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. So yeah, both Ayla and I, we've learned about ACT, independently in our own training and education, and employed it in our work. And then we got trained through you in the process therapy model, and we both found that there were some interesting and surprising overlaps between the two models. Surprising because they come from just very different backgrounds. Their origins are very different. ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, is a behavioral therapy model. It's part of the third wave of behavioral therapies, um, along with like DBT. Uh, uh,
Oh,
so some of just to give a brief overview, some of the overlaps uh, include they're both mindfulness-based therapies, the process model and ACT. They both emphasize allowance or acceptance of experience as a key element of dealing with suffering, right? They both involved disrupting the conceptual self or the ego, you might say. Uh, they have some overlapping treatment goals that we'll discuss, as well as an emphasis, some way of dealing with the question of orienting towards future action, developing the capacity for authentic choice or value-based action. Another point of convergence that's interesting is they both have a nice overlap with Buddhism, right? So with the process therapy model, I think there's like they explicitly, there's a lineage connection to Buddhist psychology. It's like just something that they directly learned from, right? But with ACT, one thing that's very curious and interesting about ACT is that it was supposedly, but I think in like genuinely developed pretty much without any awareness of Buddhist psychology, uh, but surprisingly aligning very strongly with the insights of Buddhist psychology, which is a very interesting just point of convergence and topic in itself. Um, so yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Ayla now to kind of dig into some of this.
hmm.
Yeah, those points were really interesting too, especially that piece around how ACT and the process method both talk about, suffering as being this normal part of life and the
hmm
relationship to attachment as being something that really helps to make that suffering be something that's really hard to get past
hmm
and that idea of the self that we'll talk about a little bit more. Yeah, I thought those are really interesting overlaps that they had with Buddhism
hmm
and each other. And we talked about how one of the points that they share is the mindfulness and
hmm
how both are mindfulness based. And so both ACT and the spiral process models have this idea of wanting to focus on increasing some present moment awareness and like the ability for you to stay with the present moment, even in times of difficulty, and really increasing like your sensitivity to what's happening in the present, as opposed to being stuck in, things that might be coming up from the past or doing a lot of future tripping, is what I like to call it. Uh, and I'm kind of curious, Dimitri, if there's anything that you might want to add about that, how that shows up in the spiral model.
The mindfulness.
Yeah, the mindfulness piece.
Yeah, I mean, I I guess this would be a good time for me to kind of give it a little bit of a spiel about it. There is this quote. I don't know who says it, but it says it's an old maxim, and it goes, "The fool that persists in his folly will become wise."
Mm.
Um, and I think that's kind of the model in a nutshell. So, like, the idea is if a person does what they're already doing mindfully,
Mm,
or on purpose, they will become wise. Whether or not that behavior or temperament or attitude is self-defeating, it could very well be self-defeating. Um, but that it only is harmful when done without awareness, or like an automatic, a sort of a mindless pattern of behavior, and then over and over again, it becomes like a condition where people suffer. So the definitely mindfulness of the happening, even if it's seemingly self-defeating, is the cornerstone of the process model, is to do what you're already doing, but with a greater awareness.
Yeah.
I think how that feels really like non-pathologizing, right? That there is some wisdom in what you're doing if you're able to be present with it. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Right, right. And that way you can learn about whether or not you want to keep doing it, what's useful about it, is there some adaptive aspects of features in it? Um, do you want to keep doing it? And going back to choice, it provides
Hmm.
awareness. It gives you a little bit of choice. Oh, I'm doing this. And if we invite the client to do it on purpose, that already inadvertently makes it seem as though I'm choosing it.
Mm,
So I'm choosing to suffer right now. Let me, and since I'm choosing, I might as well notice how I'm making that decision, what's involved in that decision. That's the mindfulness.
Hmm.
yeah, I like that that's something that happens during the session with the spiral process model.
Mhm.
I think it does happen also in ACT, but typically it's like in the form of homework, right? You might talk about it. There's this very like top-down approach in ACT, as opposed to like the bottom up of like experiencing it during the session. And there is an experiential element to it. It does come out of like the experiential therapy school of thought. Um, but it happens with a lot more talking, I think. And then like giving you a homework assignment for like a behavioral experiment where you might test out the thing that you're working on out in the world. But I like that we have that opportunity to really do it in the present during the process
Mm.
model.
Yeah, I wonder if you both can answer, either of you can answer. Maybe I haven't really ever looked into it, but what is the definition of behavioral therapy? Like,
Hmm.
what is what is it even? Like,
I feel like this is the uh depends on who you ask, right? Like
Hmm.
it's one of those, it depends. I know that in the tradition that like I feel like the most affinity for, it's the radical behaviorist tradition. And it's radical in the sense of like all-encompassing, not like radical, like extreme. And so behavior is anything that we do, which includes like things that are happening internally. So like our thoughts and our judgments and emotions are also included in behavior. And so that's like the root of behaviorism. And I think that over time, like as you know, Jason was talking about the different waves, but over time, there's been different ways of conceptualizing behavior. And so I think that the one that's usually more popular that people think about is what is discrete and like visual, like what can you see somebody doing? And I think that's more likely what comes to mind when somebody's talking about behavior therapy. But I guess I think it's important to name that there is also a tradition of including like thoughts, emotions,
Hmm.
behavior, because that was for me the game changer where I was like, now this makes sense to me.
Right. There's overt and covert
Hmm.
varieties of behavior, right? So, at least from the behavioral lens, everything that a living being does is behavior. There's the overt, visible, external behaviors that we do with our bodies. But then there's all the internal processes that are going on, emotions, sensations, and thoughts. Maybe I'm not sure if a sensation would count as behavior, but maybe to some people. But it's any kind of puzzle piece in the process of the just the ongoing flow of the organism. It can be described as a behavior, right? So they're all part of the cause and effect chain of the life of the organism, and uh, so yeah, ACT that very much emphasizes both the overt and the covert uh, types of behaviors in this in line with radical behaviorism.
And is it the behavioral therapy, generally speaking, is that a focus on that I something about my behavior that I don't like, that's why I'm coming into therapy? Because I would assume that it's not like, that you have that there's a certain right behavior for everybody. Is that the basis? Is that I don't like my behavior and that's why I'm coming in, or is it I'm trying to change my behavior?
Yeah, I think behavior change is kind of the goal, usually when anybody comes to therapy, right? But I think something important too to name is that ACT specifically comes from a school of thought called contextual behavior. So contextual behavior science is the idea that behavior happens in context. And so it doesn't just include like you, but it also includes like the context of the past and the context of, your environment and also your community and all of those things like are part of the behavior. So behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. And
Got
I
it.
think that there are some models that maybe don't have spaciousness for that. So it's maybe important to name that that's also what we're talking about.
Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, so ACT ultimately the goal in ACT is to help clients uh, behave develop a value directed life uh, through action that is guided by their values, right? But in order to get there, in order to do that, they discovered that uh, all this stuff gets in the way. Our cognitive, emotional stuff, it gets in the way of being of us being able to do that. And it was in the exploration of that more the internal, like covert stuff, that all the ways in which this overlaps nicely with both Buddhism and process therapy. I think it's most of that is in that kind of covert aspect of it.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
which is where it gets very, for instance, paradoxical. And so we'll get more into that. So, um,
And I guess I didn't mention yet, but one of the ways that the mindfulness is approached in the ACT method is starting off with this idea of being able to create some distance between you and thoughts that might be creating some like rigid rules for you. So in the behavioral tradition, sometimes they call it the rule governed behavior. And so rather than you responding to the context that you're in, you might have a rule based on something that happened in the past that's actually dictating what you do. And so you want to put some space in between like that rule in your head by using something called cognitive diffusion, right? And it's diffusion, not diffusion. And so it's unfusing, right? Um,
mhm.
from this idea that you have to behave in a specific way or follow a specific rule. Um, so yeah.
Hmm. Kind of like a limiting belief or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hmm.
There's different
Uh,
things that are used. Like some of them would be things like singing the thought. Like if you know the thought is like, I can't wear blue shoes, which is like, a silly example, but I can't wear blue shoes. If that's the thought that's dictating, what color shoes you wear every day, then you might do something like say that over and over and over again until it just feels like silly sounds. And then something like that would shift your relationship to this rule that you have, right? So there's different like little strategies that are used within ACT to kind of shift your relationship to the rule. Um, and yeah, that's one of them.
mhm.
Hmm.
And I think there's something similar that happens in process therapy interventions, right? So often we'll invite the client to kind of do what they're already doing, right? And um, or to do more of it, right? And as they do that, their cognitive relationship to what they do, to the underlying process that they're playing out, right? And the beliefs that condition that process, as they do it intentionally, developing mindfulness of what they do. Uh, Even though, in the process model, we don't talk about cognitive diffusion, what we are engendering is cognitive diffusion, where that is part of what is happening in that process when a client, continue just is given the instruction to keep doing what they're already doing, but pay attention, right? Their cognitive relationship to it shifts. They're no longer doing it unconsciously in a way that's hooked or fused to their cognitions, now this space opens up where some diffusion arises and they're able to kind of see the limiting belief, right? Or whatever the beliefs are, the cognitions are that kind of have them stuck in this habitual reactive way of behaving.
Yeah. I actually I want to give an example
Hmm.
because it does, well, for at least with the process model, it does cut into like a major core belief and even potentially a personality shift where, so like for example, if a client comes in and they say, "Oh, I'm very angry," and the therapist will create a paradoxical invitation where they'll say, "Okay, I want you to stay angry right now," or "I want you to be even more angry." And then the client, for example, might ascertain that the anger is at their mom or something, and it's like an early childhood thing. And and as the therapist continues to invite anger, and even perhaps like with putting an empty chair or something, or just even visualizing being angry at the parent, the client might brush up against a limiting belief,
Hmm.
like such as, oh, children, a good son doesn't get angry at the parent.
Hmm.
A good boy doesn't yell at mom, or like that. That's the belief, right?
Hmm.
And so, and that's where it's a very beautiful and interesting complex where the symptom actually is the cure, because the symptom is like, although at the face value, like, oh, I don't want to be an angry person, I need to go to anger management. It's not acceptable to be angry, right?
Hmm.
But in this case, it's the very thing that potentially is challenging the limiting belief, or is creating this cognitive diffusion. Because now, if they stay angry, that means that they're going against their rule,
Hmm.
which is like I can't be a bad son, because nice sons don't
Right.
get their parents.
Right.
And then so at that point, if they actually like allow themselves to more fully be angry at their parents, they can actually diffuse, like you said,
Right.
or break away from the emotional attachment to that need, that belief, or that need to be
Right.
a good son or something.
Exactly. For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Dimitri.
There's, you kind of started to get into the conversation about acceptance and allowance, which
Mm.
I do want to talk about. But before we move on, there was something that I was thinking about that I really love about the process model, where you get to explore these things in a more somatic way.
Hmm.
And so there's also this element of like tension and release. Like I have like I have this understanding of this from like my background in yoga, and how that is a really powerful way of being able to process something, right? And so in a way, when you're having the client be angrier or even just repeat the word over and over, you're creating that tension. And then you're also able to approach that release on the other side of it of like, wait a second, like this maybe isn't, it's no longer serving me in the same way, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, so I'm going to discuss the topics of, or introduce another key concept from ACT, which is acceptance. It's in the name, acceptance and commitment therapy, right? So this connects back again to Buddhism and Buddhist psychology, right? The first two of the Four Noble Truths are, just the ubiquity of suffering, and the cause of suffering is identified in Buddhism as tanha, which is most accurately, I think, translated as thirst in a literal sense, but most frequently translated as clinging or attachment, right? Um, and and this manifests in a variety of ways, right? Uh, uh, so in the ACT model, uh, the term that's used here, the kind of analog to this attachment, is experiential avoidance. This is like a key concept in
That's the
ACT,
term. Uh-huh.
experiential avoidance, right? So, and this corresponds really neatly. I think the analog in the process model is resistance, right? That's the term that you use to kind of point to the same phenomenon, right? Which is, the thing that drives a wedge between myself and my life, right, is my resistance to life, right? I'm constantly wanting life to be different than it is, right? And because I want life to be different than it is, I suffer, right? Because I never have what I want if I always want it to be different than it is, right? And so I might do that by avoiding what's here because it's unpleasant, or by clinging to what's here right now because I don't want to lose it, which of course I eventually will, right? Um, both of those are, in either case, I'm practicing experiential avoidance, and really experiential avoidance, it pervades all of our experience. Really, if the more kind of finely you start to observe your experience, the more you'll see it at finer and finer levels, right? Or resistance, right? Um, and so the antidote to experiential avoidance in ACT is acceptance, right? And just as the antidote to resistance in the process model um, is allowance,
Wow.
right? So there's, I, to my mind, these are kind of pointing to essentially the same thing, but with slightly different connotations. I think on a fine level, there may be some differences in the implications, but I think the overall sense is the same, right? Um,
Yeah, that's great.
yeah, yeah.
I'm also having a slight realization about that in a way the holding on is like when a person is resisting an experience or avoiding an experience, they're simultaneously holding on to something else,
Hmm.
right? So like for instance, if I'm holding on to a relationship, that means I'm resisting aloneness.
Hmm.
So it's like that's the other side of the coin.
Right.
Going back to your thirst, the second
Hmm.
noble truth. Uh, so like thirst is the same thing as resistance. I mean, when
Yeah.
you're holding on, so one thing you're pushing something else away that is its opposite.
Hmm. Exactly.
It's like
Yeah.
that rigid rule following piece of like, I have to be with somebody is like this rule that you created that
Hmm.
you can't create any distance from.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah, if I'm alone, that means something
Mhm.
for me. Right.
Yeah. And another related element of ACT that I also see resonating with the process model is the concept of creative hopelessness. So this is generally regarded for most clients. This will be like the first stage of ACT, which is where the therapist will try, usually through like an extended metaphor, either involving the Chinese finger trap or quicksand or digging a bottomless hole, some kind of impossible situation, right? Um, the idea is to help clients recognize that their resistance to the way that they try to cope with their suffering only adds fuel to the fire. It only makes it worse. And so the hopelessness is in regard to the futility of the way they tend to do things, right? But it's creative because it opens space for uh, a new way of doing things, which is guided by mindfulness, right? And so even though this is not like, there may not be like a corresponding concept in the process model, I think that in the same way, the kind of paradoxical interventions that we use, inviting clients to do more of that, right? Keep doing what you're doing. Let's intensify that. Part of the experience of doing that is to recognize the futility. On the one hand, a client might develop appreciation for the hidden positive intent of their symptom, right, or of their behavior that doesn't seem to be serving them. But they also will start to recognize the futility of it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And even sometimes like actually be able to feel and experience the futility of it if you're doing
Mm,
it. Like I think it's not as common to be talked about when people are talking about ACT, but I do appreciate that that's a really big part of the the spiral process model, like we might use like a rope or something
Hmm.
to actually experience that struggle until you get to that point of being tired and you realize this is not really a sustainable thing, right? And there's similar enactments in ACT. Like I've done one with a kiddo where you ball up pieces of paper and the papers are problems and you kind of throw them at the kid and you tell them, so try to stop every single one. And they're like trying to do all of this and it's like, well, I'm tired and I can't, right? And so you still get to experience that futility and realize, okay, maybe if I allow them, right? That's literally what you do. You accept that they're coming at you, you allow them to happen, then you have energy to then make a different choice. And so I find that you don't really use that tool as often in ACT unless you're working with children. And I think that's kind of a missed opportunity, which
Mm.
is why I really appreciate that it's built into like the foundation of the model that we use at Spiral.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and we have this term, I don't know if it comes from Gestalt, but I think it's something along the lines of uh, reveal its absurdity.
Hmm.
Hmm.
That's the equivalent. Uh,
Yeah.
that you do it to see how absurd it really is. Like sometimes we would tell like working with a client, a couple or maybe a client where we invite the client to say something like, my you're in charge of my feelings. Like to reveal how, like, because sometimes people will like
Maybe. Yeah.
give off their responsibility to other people
Hmm.
and say,
Yeah.
oh, this person makes me angry,
Hmm.
or they I get they make me react, or I have so like sometimes we would invite them to name, oh, you're in charge of my feelings
Right.
to the other person, so that to reveal how absurd. And when you say it, it's kind of like back to your point, Ayla, like sometimes when you actually say it and really kind of put it to the forefront, then it kind of feels a little absurd.
Hmm.
That challenges the sort of like status quo of the experience.
Hmm.
Yep.
I also like the idea of creative hopelessness.
Hmm.
It sort of kind of underlines the amount of effort that goes into suffering, or the that how much how it is a kind of a creative endeavor to
Yeah.
get tangled up and to talk around issues. Often clients will have all sorts of sort of like defense mechanisms where they'll be like,
Mhm.
oh, I have a fear of spending money and I need to work through that. But on the other hand, I really like spending money and I have no problem with it at all. Or like, or you get kind of, get tangled up in your own creative way of avoiding the issue or something,
Hmm.
That's how I take it. Is that kind of what they're talking about
I
with?
think it definitely can be. Like I like
Hmm.
that framing of it too. It reminds me of something that is from um I'm not sure of the exact model, but the idea of like generative friction. Like there is a reason or there is a functional thing that can come out of like the friction that you might be coming up against.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think like this could be a good time to kind of talk about the last piece, or not really the last piece, but the next piece, which is like the values element of
Hmm.
experiment therapy. And so it overlaps with the spiral process method and that it's an opportunity to start making choices about how you want to move, right? And I think in the spiral method, it's encompassed in the integration and choice parts of the process, where you're shifting your relationship to the storm, I think is the analogy that you used, and you're creating a new picture. And you kind of do that in ACT through that creative hopelessness and even just by like exploring the thing that you maybe are repeating over and over, there's usually some information in there about what's important to you. And you can take that exploration of the thing that maybe you're doing over and over that's important to you. And even though it might seem like something that's like problematic, there's something in there that you can turn into a value, right? So, if I could think of an example, like maybe you are finding that you are eating foods that are not healthy for you, right? And that's causing some health issues. But on the other side of that, maybe you realize that through exploring that process a little bit more, you actually really value being able to make your own food at home, right? And so then you might be able to get to a point of being able to describe a value there of maybe like valuing creativity and then being able to change your relationship to like how can I still have that option of being creative with my food, um, but also be healthy, which might be the other value since you're, in therapy wanting to change how you're eating, right? Um, and I think that there's a lot of like nuance there. Like that's just the only example I could think of right now. But either way, you're trying to get to a point of where you're able to make a choice without being attached to like this idea of, you know, what I'm doing is bad or what I'm doing is wrong, but there might actually be a value underneath what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I want to ask something because I wonder if it's implicated in ACT because with the process model, we have like, well, both in Mendel's like primary and secondary signal and in the Hadlock's like this whole edging um, element, the values and the conceptual self are related
Mhm.
because basically how it works is that your conceptual self is a provisional pretense based on what you think you're supposed to do. Like the values that you accrue from society and from your parents, those aren't your real values,
Right.
right? Those are like you be a good boy
Hmm.
and don't you lie or whatever, right? Those aren't really your values, and that's part of the reason why people get tripped up because they don't know they don't have a certain level of center when making
Hmm.
decisions. And so that's where it gets really tricky because, well, with the process model, the whole the focus is on non-duality and paradox because you have to temporarily be bad, or you have to allow yourself to scramble the whole thing and to be like uh non-dual
Hmm.
for and that serves the purpose to diffuse or dismantle the conceptual self
Mhm.
so that you can reach the true self, and then from there the true value then is then reached or attained
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that value comes from like my own what I need, not from what my mom told me I should need.
Right.
Right.
So there's like a temporary non-dual
Hmm.
phase, and sometimes people think like it's like a dark art or something, but it
Right.
really is in service of dismantling the conceptual self.
Hmm.
Is that similar to ACT?
It is similar. It is similar.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then once you had kind of have like you said, you figure out like what your North Star is or like what is important to you, then that becomes the way that you can continue to move in alignment with what's important to you, right? And once you know that, even if you're up against something that's difficult, you have something to kind of motivate you through it, right? If I know that I value creativity, then I might do something that's difficult in honor of like my value of creativity that I may have avoided before. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Because that's the true value,
Mhm.
Right.
not keeping up with my conceptual mask or something, right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So one thing that's discussed in some of the ACT literature is, is kind of holding our values with an open palm too, and not getting too attached to them either, right? Because then they just become attachments and cause more suffering, right?
Mhm.
So values are things that can change with time. An accurate, authentic value is a direction uh, of behavior that aligns with, the direction of your life, of the organism, right? So So values can be right for the moment, and but maybe in a future date, you need to shed that, and a new value needs to take its place, right? Um, so so it's not like a super rigid, like, okay, here's your values, and it's definitely not prescriptive. There are no right values, right? The only right values are the ones that resonate with your life in that moment, right?
Hmm.
That really points to like the overall goal, which is like psychological flexibility in ACT,
Hmm.
which I know we also talk about flexibility in the spiral process method, right? And so being able to respond and to be responsive instead of reactive kind of requires you to have that flexibility, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking that there's so much to integrate because it's like, I mean, like a lot of these sort of integrated models, like Gestalt or IFS, or the holistic experiential field as a whole, there's a great emphasis on like be all in one cohort, like come together so all the parts are like cooperating, right? So like uh, if I can mobilize myself in one cohort, then I have greater potential
Mm-hmm.
as a human being. If I want to do something, like I want to go left, but then my right foot wants to go right, then like I'm stuck, right? Because I'm fighting against myself. I'm my own adversary, and so it's interesting to. Uh, it seems like that is a probably a commonality too amongst these two models is that like that as you're deciding your values, you're sort of sifting through like opposing elements, right? Or like disagreements
Hmm.
amongst yourself, like um where and then given the context, right, of your environment and what you need to do, how do you navigate relationships and you know appease people, but or also cooperate with your environment, um, and then at the end, and then still find some kind of unity and choice.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So there's this also the role of the transcendent self, we'll call it, as an umbrella term.
Mm.
So, both of these models involve contacting transcendent layers of self in some sense or another, right? Uh, so the most in ACT, the most well-known kind of uh, framing for this is the term self as context, which overlaps quite a bit with uh, concepts like the witnessing self or the observer self, right? Which is common amongst a lot of spiritual and religious traditions, and also shows up, in process-oriented therapy. Um, so in both of these models, the idea is that there's some kind of therapeutic value to contacting a transcendent layer of self, right? And in both models, also it's considered they both aim to disrupt or kind of dethrone the conceptual self, which uh, uh, we might call it the ego or the small self, right?
Hmm.
Um, so in ACT, so self as context is kind of the most well-known kind of transcendent self. And we might think of this as like the timeless self. And Steve Hayes, the guy who developed it, who developed ACT, he uses this term from here-ness to describe self as context, which I like a lot. And it kind of points to the kind of timeless element of self as context. It's like no matter where or when you are from here, right? And so it transcends space and time, right?
Hmm.
But he also talks about self as process, which is the kind of layer, the transcendent layer of self that is in time, that flows through time from moment to moment, right? And so I think it can be interesting to kind of parse between these maybe two different kinds of a transcendent self, or maybe aspects of a transcendent self, right? And I think both of these show up in the process model, right? Obviously, self as process, we're constantly kind of pointing the client directly towards self as process by having them bring mindful awareness to the ongoing process that's going on in the moment, right? But then, uh, you know, you also talk a lot in the spiral model about facilitating Zen states, right? Which I think, uh, depending on how we think about Zen states, I think it can overlap both with like self as process and self as context. Um, and and there's also an element maybe of non-duality here, as which you pointed to earlier. Um, Going back to the ACT concepts, the self as context and self as process. The self as process is, again, it's like in time, uh, and the self as context is in a sense outside of time. One way of There are many ways of kind of defining non-duality, but a common way of defining it or conceptualizing it in Buddhism is the distinction and, in a sense, unity between uh, the relative perspective and the absolute perspective, right? And so, like we go through, we develop some self-awareness, some spiritual development, and we come to this like transcendent perspective where everything makes sense. And it's like, oh yeah, I get a glimpse of enlightenment, right? And it would be nice to just be able to stay there in this absolute perspective. But of course, we are human beings living in time, and we have to come back into the relative perspective. And so for many people, I think the spiritual journey is a process of kind of toggling between these two perspectives. Uh, and uh, and
Well,
so this self as context and self as process, I feel like kind of point to this kind of the non-dual unity of these elements.
and I would also add that that there's a, depending on how you define the terms, but there's actually a very um, maybe expeditious or a very practical way to see them as something very similar. Transcendent and process is like um, process. To see the self as a process is more of an organismic element of like the formality of just behavior, like the formality of how things are occurring. There's no
Hmm.
self in it. It's just an organism moving or sitting or
Right,
just being, right? So that's the process level.
right.
And and in a way, the transcendent self is actually can be seen on the same level because like when we ask the therapist, go ahead and transcend yourself while you're with the client, what that really says is that your selfhood doesn't matter. Like the fact that you think you're a therapist, that's selfhood, right? So like a hat, like
Hmm.
when you hold on to a role, I'm a therapist, I'm an expert, right? And so, in a way, transcending the self has to do with not transcending that your here and nowness, but transcending your meager or the arrogance of personhood, the fact that you believe to be something that you're conceptually created.
Hmm.
And so, when you transcend yourself, you don't transcend the organism, at least from on this perspective, from this level. You don't transcend the organism. You
No,
just
no,
transcend your identity hat,
right.
Yeah.
which then just flattens it back down to earth, like you're just back to just organismic
Yeah.
event happening.
Hmm.
So that can also be seen as a transcendent state.
Hmm.
I guess it just depends on how you define it, because you can also define the transcendent state as something that is like vertically ascended,
Mm,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ava.
I was gonna say that definitely resonates with like my understanding of how it's used in Act Two, and there is a little bit of a basis in like Darwinism in Act, where like the idea is that part of being able to be psychologically flexible is like what it actually means to be an organism, because part of like organicity and just like living life is to be able to vary your behavior and select new behaviors and change when you need to
Hmm.
and retain the things that are actually working and let go of the things that are not. So there's that variation, the selection and the retention piece that's like part of the evolutionary science that's embedded in like the ACT framework. And then like when it comes to thinking of like the self, like you just said, like you're letting go of this label of how you see yourself, like that can definitely create suffering, right? If you're attached to this idea of like, I'm a therapist, and then you encounter something that confronts that and you don't allow yourself some space for like variation, then you're going to be feeling a lot of, uncomfortable feelings around the rigidity of like, I'm only this one thing.
Yeah, and that could be
Hmm.
seen as a transcended state
Mhm.
when you move beyond that, right?
Hmm.
Well, I think it's time that we wrap it up. I want to thank you both for participating and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Dimitri.
Okay.
Thank you.